On this episode of Hot Rod Hoarders, I'm telling you the story of Jim Barillaro, and I'm going to show you an exclusive look at his crazy collection of Ford parts, and it includes two of the most iconic cars in drag racing history. So to take you back to the beginning, Jim Barillaro Jr. grew up in Connecticut. His very first car was a Ford Model A two-door sedan, and he started modifying this car, making it quicker and faster, making it look cooler, all the things that a hot rodder would do back in the 50s and 60s. He started by modifying the original four-cylinder engine, then switching to a Y-block, and then he eventually put a 406 Ford engine in it. He started Jim's Speed Emporium in 1962 and never looked back. He always fooled with hot rods and drag cars, and all of that really kicked off with this Ford Model A two-door sedan. This was his first car and his first hot rod. When the Model A sort of ran its course, Jim stepped up to a 57 Ford, and he ended up drag racing this car in B-modified production throughout the mid-60s. And eventually he ended up building a 1967 Ford Falcon wheel stander. It was called the Windjammer. And this thing, it had kind of a wild paint job. Obviously it was wild on the track because these wheel standers were just absolutely unpredictable. He ended up wrecking the car pretty severely, but he rebuilt it again, giving it another fresh look. And you'll notice that it went from the Windjammer to another paint job that had Jim's Speed Emporium really big on the side of it, a great advertisement for his shop. And then ultimately it went back to the Windjammer, and that kind of coincided with another car that he was campaigning at the time. And Jim found that he was having to really lean on this car pretty hard to get it through the traps up on the back bumper. So he made the reasonable choice and put another engine in it. So this thing had two 427 based Ford engines, both with Hilburn fuel injection. Really a wild combination that just put on a show for thousands of fans for several years. Ultimately, he ended up selling the car in the early 70s, and allegedly it did live on to be a drag car later on. But about 20 years later, Jim's son's shop teacher actually brought him these two front fenders, and they still had the original paint, the original lettering that he had on the car way back in the 60s. So it's kind of crazy to think that these things still survived all these years, and they ended up back in Jim's hands again. And then the hood was another strange deal because that was completely separate. It was bought at a swap meet and still had the original diagonal stripes, the really cool original paint that was on there back in the late 60s and early 70s. So while Jim was campaigning the wheel stander, he also wanted to build a more serious race car, something he could actually go compete with. And his idea was to build a top fuel dragster. And he wanted to base his build around a 427 cubic inch single overhead cam Ford engine. Now these things are legendary. They came out in 1965, and they were in all of the top Ford and Mercury drag cars at the time. He wanted to build a car around one of those engines, and he happened to be friends with John Healy at Tasca Ford, which helped him to be able to gather up some parts and start building a really killer single overhead cam engine. Somewhere along the way, plans changed, and Jim ended up building a funny car. He actually built a Torino funny car, one of only 4 fiberglass limited bodies that were made. And even though it was a pretty conventional Logie style chassis underneath, the big Torino body just made this thing look wild. And it was called the Camera Jammer because of the camera engine, and it kind of tied in with the Windjammer wheel stander. So for a short while, he actually campaigned both of these cars. So he would haul 2 cars to the racetrack, go put on a show with the wheel stander, go put on a show with the Camera Jammer, and he was living pretty big. And at this time, he's just in his 20s, and he's out there just absolutely living the dream. What he quickly realized was that it was pretty expensive to go out and campaign 2 cars. Now the wheel stander often paid for his expenses on the funny car, but it was a ton of work. It was a ton of wear and tear on parts times 3. We're talking 3 engines that he was having to maintain, 2 for the wheel stander and a really radical 427 camera in the funny car. The Torino ran a best of 754 at 201 miles per hour, and he raced it until 1970. It started catching up with him. The expense, the work, the time, everything was really adding up, and it was just time to really focus on his business. And that car, he kind of parted it out on his own. He kept the engine, the blower, the injector, the drive line, the wheels and tires, all that stuff he kept. And eventually that car got passed around, and it's now in the Memory Lane Museum in Mooresville, North Carolina. And they'd really love to have this car back because it'd be a great way to finish off the collection. Racing really slowed down for Jim in the 1970s. He started focusing more on his business, more on his family, and just took a break from racing. But in 1983, he got his motivation back. Jim drove his car hauler all the way from Connecticut to Alberta, Canada, over 2,000 miles each way, to go buy Jack Chrisman's old Mercury Comet. This was basically the first funny car. Now, the term hadn't even been invented yet when this car came out on the scene. It was an incredible piece. It got rebuilt, it got shuffled around, it got sold off, and this thing somehow or another ended up in Canada. And that's where he ended up buying it. And the car had had quite a few changes through the years. It had a different paint job. It had Magician lettered on the quarter panels. It had a wedge-headed 427 in it, Hilburn fuel injected, but Jim had the idea to buy this car and completely restore it back to its original condition. He bought the car in 1983 and made pretty quick work of the restoration. All those parts that he had kept from the Torino funny car came in pretty handy, because he had the engine, he had all sorts of parts gathered up that was ready to go on this car, and he even kept the wheels and tires off of the Torino, and he did some excellent work recreating the world's first funny car. So, he loved taking this thing and telling its story and being able to tell a little bit of his story as well. And, he was able to put kind of his twist on this iconic car. And I plan to do a full feature on this car with all the history I can dig up on it. So stay tuned for a future episode where we really dig into the history on this car. And we're going to dig into the history on another car, a 1967 Jack Chrisman Mercury Comet funny car. And this will probably be a good time to remind you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Leave a comment down below if you like. And we're going to keep getting into this collection because there's still a lot more to go. So as I made my way around the shop, the 67 flip-top funny car just seemed to be the focal point. It was sitting on the lift. We had lifted the body up to get a better look at the Logie chassis and the camera and all the parts and pieces that make this car so cool. And ultimately, it's packed with more of Jim's parts that he had saved up through the years. This car came a little bit later in Jim's life. He actually found the body in 1987 and then pieced the thing together and painted and fixed it and restored it back to the way it was. And, through the years, he's collected a lot of different parts for a lot of different projects. And from what I understand, Jim actually sold a lot of parts through the years. So at various times when he'd need to free up a little bit of money, he'd sell off a bunch of stuff. It was not really all that sentimental to him, but he did have some certain things that he held on to through the years. And that's what we're going to get into now. In the back corner of the shop here, there's a bunch of really cool stuff, and we have to really dig in to understand the significance of it, but there's just a story behind every part and every piece that's on display here. So the first thing that I noticed when I walked up was this giant chunk of aluminum that has cast into the bottom of it Barillaro SOHC, single overhead cam. So this was a blank block for a 427 camera. This was going to power a Mustang II funny car that Jim was going to build and run on the professional circuit. He had a local foundry that helped him make this block, but NHRA outlawed single overhead cam engines in 1977. So the plan to build that car went away, but he kept this block, and he has another bare block underneath the workbench. But these pieces right here are just absolutely priceless. They're not necessarily useful to anybody right now because they're pretty rough finish. They're not a finished machine block, but they are just cool pieces. Where else are you going to see a custom block for a Ford camera that's got the guy's name cast right into the side of it? Other cool pieces back here is the custom dual drive box that went to the wheel stander. Jim held on to this thing for all these years. It's a big old heavy steel case that helped make sense of the two 427 engines that were sort of in line. One was right behind him and one was sort of in the trunk area. So this box fed all of that power into the rear end. You'll see some other parts hanging on the wall here that have Barillaro's name cast right into it. Again, he had a local guy at a foundry that was helping him make some parts, and there's still plenty of stuff here with the Barillaro name on it. At some point in the 1990s, Jim and his two twin sons moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and Jim ended up in this shop where he had plenty of room to work on his projects. He also built an apartment in the shop to where he could stay here and live and hang out and be with all of his stuff, and it was just a really cool setup for him. But unfortunately, Jim ended up passing away in 2017, and the two boys, Jim and Mike, they ended up taking over where their dad left off by paying tribute to this collection of parts. They've displayed it in a really tasteful way, and they've made a tribute to him in the back corner here. And this is actually his urn, this small moon tank that's got hand lettering on it. It's actually mounted to one of his cast aluminum main girdles. It's for a 427 camera. This thing is this is the coolest way to pay tribute to your father, and it's a cool way to have him right there in the shop with them every single day. When they come in and they're building cool exhaust systems and they're doing sheet metal work on hot rods, their dad's right there with them. So I just can't think of a better way to honor him and continue his legacy than to have him right there and to have him surrounded by those things that he's collected all these years. The parts, the cars, and just so much history all wrapped up into one place. I also love that they framed all these old pictures of the Comets, and you'll see here that they have a killer collection of vintage tools. They've got an old distributor machine that you test your distributor with, and then Jim's original snap-on toolbox that you can see in that old picture that I just showed you. It's right here. The thing still survives. It's still functional, still doing work to this day. I had the pleasure of looking at some of the old scrapbooks and photos and magazine articles and clippings from their family history, and just, looking at some of the documentation on some of these cars was really cool. But my all-time favorite pictures out of their collection are these two shots that were taken inside of their barn back in the mid-80s. The first one shows the Comet in there. The engine's out of it. You can see it on a stand turned upside down. There's pistons sitting on a table. This thing is ready to go together, and there's parts just everywhere. There's parts scattered. There's parts hanging on the wall. The front end to the Comet is actually sitting on top of a T-bucket body. And the second picture, taken from the same angle, shows the Comet is a little further along. We got the engine in there. Obviously, there's still some work being done in there. But in the background, that T-bucket body has now turned into a complete car. And the coolest thing in the world is that both of these cars still sit side by side to this day. Now, they're obviously not sitting in this barn, but they're sitting in the shop where Jim and Mike do business every day. But this T-bucket still looks just like it did in the 1980s. The flames, the big block Ford, the Kragers, every piece of it is just like it was. Even the tires are original. Firestone Super Sport rear tires, big old tires and 10-inch wide Kragers. And for Jim and Mike, they spent their childhood climbing all over this thing and pretending like they were driving it. And the same can be said for the Comets. Both Comets, they were part of their childhood. Part of their upbringing was being surrounded by Ford camera parts, by these iconic cars, and a dad who was extremely passionate about all of it. And obviously that passion bled over into what they do, and they've been very successful in doing fabrication work and building hot rods of their own. They've really taken what he instilled in them and ran with it. Customer cars that were in the shop while I was there include a 32 Ford 5-window coupe built by Hilton Hot Rods. They were putting an exhaust system together for it. Then there's a Model A Ford chassis sitting here, Model A two-door sedan body that's going to be getting put together here soon. Then there's a Model A coupe and a killer 34 Ford 5-window coupe. Lots of cool projects in here. Again, they've got projects of their own too, and their cars get a lot of attention wherever they go because these guys have the vision for killer hot rods, and they have the ability to turn that vision into the real thing. One of the coolest pieces out of this whole collection, in my opinion, is this Model A sedan. And even though it looks like just another one of their project cars in this whole row of cars back here, it's not. This is a significant car in their family's history. This is their dad's original car, his first hot rod, and it's right up here on the chassis table, and it's getting put back together again. And you'll see that the body's in pretty good shape, and it has a custom dual frame rail round tube chassis under it. And this thing has tons of cool history too, because after he took it apart, after it had the Y block and the 406 in it, he actually had some legit GT40 road racing suspension pieces that he was putting underneath this car. Ultimately, plans changed and it no longer has those pieces, and they got sold off, and I don't know what happened to them, but this is going to be a killer hot rod. And I don't know exactly the plans, but they've got this thing kind of mocked up as far as figuring out the stance, figuring out the wheel and tire combination. And that's another thing, the front wheel and tires on this car. Those are magnesium American Racing torque thrust wheels, 15x4s. The tires, those are old tires from the mid-60s. And those were the original tires and wheels that were on the 1964 version of Jack Chrisman's Mercury Comet. Unbelievable to see that kind of history, and it's so cool to see them take historical parts and utilize them on one of their dad's old cars. And just like in that old picture we looked at, there's still parts everywhere. They're hanging up on the wall, they're up on shelves, and there's some really crazy stuff in here, and we'll just go through some of these items because they have some cool backstory. So up on the shelf you'll see a magnesium blower case that's got a Hilburn 4-port fuel injection system on it. Now this combination, along with the tray and the spark plugs, that actually came out of Jim's Ford Torino funny car. Now that engine was disassembled, parts and pieces of that engine went into the 65 Comet, but the supercharger and the injector was actually a very different setup in the original car, so he went with the Enderley style hat and the different style blower case, leaving behind this magnesium blower case and early style 4-port Hilburn fuel injection. There's also a couple of 32 Ford grill shells up here, and that aluminum bell housing you see, that's actually an original piece from the Chrisman Comet back in 1965. I'm really appreciative of Jim and Mike for welcoming me into the shop, giving me full access, giving me all of these great stories and all these things to be able to tell you guys. Because a lot of these stories haven't necessarily been told, and they certainly haven't been told to the public. So, you know, this is kind of a rare opportunity to dig in to the history of a guy who was very influential and a guy who handed down his passion and his love for hot rods, drag racing, and especially Fords to his two boys. So, you know, it means a lot to me. It's definitely relatable because, you know, I see the influence that he had on his boys, and I see the influence, obviously, that my dad had on me, and I can just only hope that I have that same kind of influence on my kids. So, you know, it was a lot of fun to walk around and to soak up some of that history, to listen to some of those family stories, and I hope you guys have enjoyed walking along and finding out some cool stuff too. So stay tuned for those two funny car features, continue supporting the channel, and we'll see you next week.